I'm Ann Garrity, and I'm an alcoholic. I always strip down a little bit when I get up here, but that's as far as I'm going to go. Sorry about that. It's good to be here. It's good to see everybody. If people that have heard me before will please leave, and then I'll start my pitch. There are people who have heard me for a long time. Gloria, sit down. You know, kind of Art, Bob, you know. Osos heard me so many times that she waves her hands and corrects me when I say something wrong. So you see that gal down there in red go, that means that, you know, made a goof again. I spoke last night at CMC. I thought they were funny looking. They love me at CMC. So anyway, but I came down tonight, and the first thing I did was they blocked the road. We had to go 20 miles all the way. Osos was starving to death, and I was getting more nervous by the minute looking for a pit stop, but there weren't any along that back road to Solvang. They turned all the lights out so we couldn't even find it. I think Ann did that on purpose, frankly. She probably thought. I called Ann a while back, and I came down through Solvang my way down to St. Augustine's Church in Palms, California, if anybody knows where that is, and she invited me to speak. And I knew I had finally arrived. You know, she'd known me for 18 years. It's the first time she'd ever asked me to speak. Sometimes she lets me read a step if I'm really good. She says, here, you can read a step. But anyway, tonight I'm the speaker. And so I went on down, and we had an election at the area assembly. And they didn't have many people to run this year, or to stand, as we say in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I stood, because my sponsor told me that I should stand and give God a chance. Well, God got upset and was off someplace, and I won. And so I called her back, and I said, yeah, you've got the delegate to speak. And she said, oh, who's that? So she didn't believe me. I was born an alcoholic. And, you know, that's a nice way to start out, frankly. The reason I know I was born an alcoholic was, as far as I can remember, my family drank. I came from Irish, Catholic, Welsh, Scotch, Indian, and Polish. I just added the Polish tonight for the people who hadn't heard me before. And they were just drinkers, and they would have drank as much as I drank at the end, except that they didn't have the opportunity. It was back in the northern part of Michigan in the 30s. I was not born in the 30s. I was growing up in the 30s, but anyway, and I can remember them drinking, you know, and I can remember thinking to myself that I would never drink. Under any circumstances, I would never drink. And most of us have gone through that. I'm surprised at the number of people that come in these days who had parents and uncles and aunts and so forth that drank. And in the beginning, I think we all said we'd never be like that. And because of circumstances and because of the way the money got in the 60s and so, that I drank more than my family ever knew about before I quit. And I was always thinking that when I got as bad as, I would quit. I never drank, I never stole or snaked drinks around the house, and I think probably that they didn't let me. I'm not sure. We didn't have a social type of drinking around our house, and so I had my first drink when I was maybe about 10 or 12 years old, and I went down to my great aunts, and I had a couple of great aunts who were Irish. They were also great Irish, but anyway, they. I was in the northern part of Michigan. It was in the wintertime, and when I went down, my Aunt Annie said to me, Ann, why don't you have a little drink of wine before you go back? Because I took the mail down after school. And it must have been about the time that Prohibition was over, because I'd never seen any wine around the house before that down at my aunt's. And I said, sure, so I had a little drink of wine. And it never occurred to me that I was drinking what my family drank. You know, I didn't realize anything about the first drink or anything. I just knew that it felt good and it warmed me up, and I suddenly had a little change of personality. And so I went next door to my other great aunt. Her name was Aunt Noonie. I mean, she was Aunt Nora, but for some reason, I suppose because I couldn't pronounce Nora, she was Aunt Noonie. She was another great aunt. And by God, she said the same thing to me. She said, Ann, why don't you have a little drink of wine before you go home? And, you know, I didn't speak up and say, well, thank you, Aunt Noonie, but I have had a drink already. I said, oh, thank you very much, and had my second drink. And if I had had another aunt, I would have gone over there and got a third one, you know. And I went sailing home in my little snowsuit and those scarves around your head, you know, and the whole thing. And that was the first time. And they tell me that people who are not alcoholic do not remember those first drinks and those first times you got drunk and so forth. But I remember that, and I didn't remember it for a long time. It came back a while back. And then the next time that I can remember drinking is the one that the old-timers like to hear the story of, and if I skip it, they get annoyed, so I'll have to tell you. And I think I have outgrown this stupid story, but I'll tell it anyway. Tell it again. A whole bunch of us girls were out at one of these camp-out things in somebody's cabin out on Lake Michigan in the cold of winter. And we had a pot-belly stove, and we were playing charades, and we all were wrapped up in our blankets. It was before the days of sleeping bags. So when it came time for me to show off my charade, I leaped out of my blanket, holding an apple in one hand and a geranium leaf in front of me, and that's all I had on. And let me tell you, that geranium leaf didn't, cover any more then than it would now. And there I stood because I'd had too much wine. And I thought maybe when they started talking about it at school the next day that I had goofed up. And I started then, and I was about 14 years old, to control my drinking. And I got on this program 30 years later, and I was still controlling my drinking as far as the public was concerned. And fortunately enough, I learned how to drink and do that kind of thing. I was really lucky. I went down to the University of Michigan School of Nursing in 1940. When you came from the poverty-stricken depression of the 30s and got to go to the University of Michigan, you were lucky. And I didn't drink much in college. And I didn't drink much in college because it wasn't available and because I wanted to be a nurse. More than anything else in the world, I wanted to be a nurse. And nothing stood in the way. I graduated from nursing school in 1943, and I got married. I got married not simply, well, actually, I was engaged a lot. At the same time I got married, I was already engaged to 4 other guys, but this guy asked me to marry him. The other one just asked me to be engaged, And I didn't know how to say no. Fortunately, sex wasn't as rough as it is these days, or otherwise I would have been pregnant and married. But anyway, I wasn't. And I said fine, and I got married. And I don't know why of that bunch that I was engaged to, I picked that one, because it was really the wrong one. We were married just a few months, and he went into the service, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, "Dear Ann," I had barely written all the Dear John letters and got them mailed. When he wasn't around, I had to write, anyway, "Dear Ann," and he wanted a divorce, and I couldn't believe it. And so I wrote and told him, "I can't believe it. I think we should wait until the war is over." And Bud wrote back, and he said no, he was going to get a divorce in North Carolina or South Carolina or someplace. And I said, my heart was broken, absolutely crushed, but my head was working. And so I got an annulment in New York. And because I knew I was going to get married again, I knew that this wasn't my only chance. I was real lucky. I raised a Roman Catholic, and I was married by a Baptist minister, so I still had a chance at the Roman Catholic Church. I thought God was working, I thought he was doing a fine job, keeping me on the straight and narrow. And I enlisted in the United States Army. I really didn't enlist in the Army. I went in the Army Nurse Corps. And the reason I went in the Army Nurse Corps, not because I'm vain, but because the Navy had to wear black stockings, and I had worn black stockings when I was a student, and that was enough. So that was my choice, and that's how I made a choice of the rest of my life's career, I went in the Army Nurse Corps, and I loved it. My God, for a girl from the northern part of Michigan, first thing I did, they put me on a Pullman train. The second thing, rode me in a Pullman with those things that came down and you climbed into, and the gal below me had a bottle. And she shared. And I had never been on a Pullman before. I never had a drink on a train before, and I thought, this is really living. I'm sophisticated. Now, really, 50 years later, I'm still not very sophisticated. But anyway, I thought I was at that time. But I had this terrific name. My name was Ann Romig, R-O-M-I-G. And I had gotten the annulment, but it wasn't final for 6 months, and so I went into service with this man's name, and I knew that for the time I was in the service, I was completely anonymous, even though I didn't know what the word meant at that time. I knew that I wasn't going to run into anybody from home that knew how my mother drank, or my father drank, or my uncle drank, or my grandfather drank, and I knew that I wasn't going to run into anybody that would ever see me afterwards and say that I was a drunk when I was in the service. And I don't know how I figured this out, because I didn't know I was going to be a drunk when I was in the service. But I went down to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, Atlantic City, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Camp Kilmer. I always drop these names because in case somebody recognizes me from their past, and that I am that one. And had my first blackout at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, and I'm going back in April, for a week at the Roosevelt as a delegate. And I'm going to probably walk in the lobby and break into tears, I did that at the Olympic. I did that at the Olympic Hotel in Seattle, Washington. We came back from overseas. We still landed at the Olympic. We went in, and I called home, and some years ago, 10 years ago or so, I went up on a process to Seattle, and they had it at the Olympic Hotel. I walked in the room, and the lobby looked exactly the same as it did in 1945 or 46, and I broke into tears. And somebody said, "What is the matter with you?" I said, "I'm so happy." Nothing like being an alcoholic. God, isn't it fabulous? People can't tell whether you're broken-hearted or whether you're having, you're having the best time of your life. It's impossible to tell. I got in the service, and I've heard some people, I haven't really heard too many people complain about the service as far as their drinking is concerned. Didn't make any difference how much you drank on Saturday night. They still served you breakfast Sunday morning. And even if you were hungover or whether you were sober, you couldn't eat it anyway, but so it didn't make much difference. I went overseas on the Matsonia, and I went over to Tinian in the Marianas, and that's where the B-29s were, and the Air Force was, and the booze flowed like crazy. And they lugged us in on this Matsonia, and they dropped anchor out there in the bay, and they little landing crafts, those ones that opened up in the front and they threw you up. And we went ashore in full fatigues and packs on our backs and gas masks, and the whole business. It was really. But when I looked up as I was coming ashore in this thing, I looked over to see what the enemy looked like, and there they were. There were 1 million men on the beachfront, and there were 1 million men over here on the breakaway. And I thought, my God, I'm in heaven. They came around the next morning and they took our liquor order. What would you like? Yeah. 4 pints, 4 quarts, was it? 2 beers, 4 beers, 1 bottle of rum or Dixie Belle gin. And I thought to myself, and these are going to be the happiest days of your life. I ran into a... I knew I'd run into one sooner or later. There were 25,000 men and there were 500 girls, and I was one of them. And I don't know how many thousands of miles I was from St. Ignace, Michigan, but I was a hell of a long way. And I've had a bad year this year. I ran into 6 people that were on Tinian. Luckily enough, none of them recognized me. But the other night somebody came up and he said he was a CB on Tinian, and he said, "You ruined our swimming." And I said, "What do you mean you ruined your swimming?" And he said, "Well, the CBs had gone in and they had bulldozed out a swimming pool. And when the nurses came, they made the CBs put their underwear back on." And I said, "Well, you didn't have to put it on for me." But we had sort of a straight-laced lieutenant colonel who was leading us, so I think we put it on for her. Don't get old nurses excited. Anyway, my drinking progressed, and it progressed so easily. It was unbelievable. It was the first time in my life I had been in a situation where there was all the booze that I wanted to drink, and there was all the, that's all I was doing. We were setting up hospitals for the returned veterans from the invasion of Japan. And if you remember, we didn't invade Japan, so we were just sitting there. They were putting up these hospitals, and we were, drinking every night until some late hour, like 9:30, and at night, not in the morning. And we were dancing, and I can't dance, I couldn't dance, but all I want to do is sort of hold you. It was sort of the Tinian shuffle, I took dancing lessons this year. You're supposed to move your feet when you dance. And this dancing teacher kept talking something about a beat, Can you hear the beat? Beat. I can't hear a beat. Can you hear a beat when you dance? Beat, beat, beat. No. Anyway, I didn't know that when I was on Tinian. I danced all the time. And I had a wonderful time. I went on up from Tinian to the occupation of Japan. Went into Curie, the first Army nurses to go into Japan after they dropped the bomb. And I was the first Army nurse to show up in Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, depending on which part of the States you're from. And there I was, and I was on the edge of history, as it were, and all we were looking for was a liquor store. We were looking for, there was a rumor that they had a whiskey building, it was a Scotch factory, or whatever they call them, there, and we were out looking for it. And I was thrilled to be in Japan, and I didn't see much of it. We did run a ward from 7 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I got my next rating because I was a good nurse. Either that or I was articulate or something or another. But I drank every day in Japan and on Tinian, and I passed out along the way someplace, came to every morning, and it was fine. Unfortunately, General MacArthur had some straight-laced ideas about having all these nurses running around Japan. I think he must have heard about our outfit, but anyway, what he did was he suggested that we all go home. And so I came home with sort of a thump. I wasn't really planning to get out of the service, and I landed in Seattle, went down to the Olympic, and called my folks, and I went on down to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and they wouldn't let us re-enlist. They had too many nurses. There's something like 40,000 of us, you know, and they didn't need them in this peacetime service. So I came back, went back to Rochester, New York, and first things first, got another husband, you know. And there was something going on about that time in people's minds. I don't know how many women, you all look so young, were in that category, but we started getting married and we started having babies. I had 6 kids in 8 years, and they just came one after another. And we didn't have much else to do. Sure, that's it. My husband went back to college, and I worked part-time. I worked all the time, really, and kept having these kids, you know. And we didn't drink for those 4 years. We didn't drink because I think Herb knew that we couldn't partially drink. I think that was the situation. I think he knew better than I that if we started drinking, that we wouldn't be able to, he wouldn't be able to graduate. And he wanted to graduate from engineering school as much as I had wanted to graduate from nursing school. So there wasn't any booze around, and there wasn't hardly any beer, occasionally a bottle of wine, I think. And so it didn't bother me. I got started on Dexedrine. There was a 1,000 bottle with 1,000 of those little heart-shaped orange pills that were Dexedrine. The first Dexedrines that came out, I was the first Dexedrine addict in the United States. How about that? You don't realize how famous I am. Anyway, I didn't even know I had a problem until I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. About 5 years after I got here, people started saying they were addicts, alcoholics. By that time, I hadn't even thought about being an addict alcoholic, and so I just say I'm an alcoholic. But I did have a little problem with non-addictive pills, including these Dexedrines. And I did not take them because they made me high, and they gave me energy, and they made me feel good. I didn't take them for that reason. I took them for one reason. I took them because I wanted to be thin. That was 30 years ago, and they haven't worked yet. But one of these days, I bet they're going to work, huh? I took enough of them. They ought to work pretty soon. We moved out to California. My husband graduated from college, and boy, we wiped the snow of northern New York off our feet. I'm not even sure if I want to go to Montreal in July, to be honest, you know. God, it was so cold in northern New York, and we were so poor. The minute I get cold, I'm poor. Now, and if they open that back door, I'll immediately become poor. I just one of those feelings, you know. It would just seem like it was absolutely terrible. So we came out here to Los Osos. We actually came out to Eureka, which is in northern California, and when we got there, we discovered there was still snow. 15th of June, and there was snow along the road. And Herb said, well, I don't think we want to stay here. And I said, no, I don't think we want to stay here. So we came on down, and we took Los Osos because it was halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And, you know, halfway to the other side of the valley. It was in the middle of everything. We never went a place for the next 20 years except up and down the roads of San Luis Obispo. One time we made it to Paso Robles. Yeah. But we were where we had to be in case we wanted to go someplace. That was and then the drinking started again. You know, just this plain old, simple, stupid housewife drinking. You know, Herb drank and I drank. We'd start out in the evening with our beer. That was the first 6-pack. And then he would go to his beer that he had hidden under the bed. And I would go to my wine that I had hidden up in the broom closet. And then we would, I would add a little to my wine. I liked the mixed drink. I liked tripenhydrate and codeine with the wine. And poured them in together into a coffee cup and drank. It got you where you wanted to go, right, honey? Yeah. That was the social part of my drinking. Social. We used to have a little guy up in Morro Bay who used to say he was a social drinker. Anybody said, I'm going to have a drink, he would say, so shall I. That's my joke for the evening. Anyway, we had 10 years of this nonsensical drinking. And I spoke in New Orleans in 1980, and this is one of the things I said, that Herb had his, and I had mine, and we had ours, and that's the way we drank. And my oldest son said, that's where I started, too. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, whenever I found another bottle around that didn't belong to anybody, but, was hidden, he figured it was free, because I wasn't going to ask Herb what happened to it, and Herb wasn't going to ask me what happened to it. But Paul did it. I couldn't believe it. He's got 5 years in the program now. So it must have worked, whatever happened to him. But I didn't intend to stop drinking. I never had any guilt. I never had any remorse. I thought I was entitled to drink. I ended up in California and had 3 more children and ended up with 5 because we lost a son with a crib death just before we left Potsdam, New York. And so I had these 5 children, always had foster children, always had kids I was babysitting, always had my friends' children around the house. And I was a Girl Scout leader and a Boy Scout leader, a Cub Scout leader. I was a room mother for 3 rooms, When I finally quit, the town started to grow, So while I was running it, it wasn't doing too well. I was sitting at a meeting Wednesday night, and this little gal walked in with this problem with alcohol. And she was one of my Girl Scouts, And she said, oh, hi, what are you doing here? And I said, let me tell you about those Girl Scout trips. Well, one time we went to Santa Barbara in this truck with a truckload of Girl Scouts, and we got down to Santa Barbara, and we went up in the hills, and I was going to dump those Girl Scouts out, and I was going back downtown to have a few drinks, because I deserved them after putting up with them all the way down there. We got down there, they had canceled the camp out. I said, do you remember that? And she said, yes. And we had to turn around and bring them all home, Those are the kind of things. I love campfiring. I love Girl Scouting. I didn't do campfire. I did Girl Scouting. I loved it. I used to love sitting out there in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night and digging my bottle up from the bottom of the sleeping bag when all the girls were asleep, and sitting there and contemplating my navel and drinking my wine. And I always had fabulous people to work with. I'm one of those people that, people like, and I had the other Girl Scout leaders, and they were great. They would say, poor Ann, let her sleep. They knew I was asleep because I snore. And I like to say that I snore because in case anybody is, thinking of going to bed with me, I'll warn you that you're not going to have a night's sleep, because I'm going to snore. But anyway, that's the commercial. I didn't intend to quit drinking. I had this beautiful, this husband of mine who drank terribly. He drank in public. I drank in private. I drank after I once got started in Los Osos. I never drank more than 2 drinks out in public the rest of the time I was there for the 10 years. My husband was an engineer with Division of Highways, and he was an honest citizen. He drank at home, he drank in bars, he drank any place he could drink, he drank in the truck, he drank on the job, but not me. I just drank at home in the privacy of my home. I was out a lot in the evening, and I would have 2 drinks, and everybody would say, isn't that wonderful? Isn't Ann great? I thought I was great. I figured if you have 2 drinks out, you're great. One time I got out, and somebody bought me the 3rd drink. That was the end of it. I was there at 2 o'clock in the morning, vomited all the way home, crawled on my hands and knees to the toilet. But I could not turn down these free drinks. Alcoholics are people that, they put these drinks in front of you. Everybody said, oh, we've never seen Ann at a bar, so they bought me a drink. And I had all these drinks lined up. Now, if you think you have too many drinks lined up, you don't have to drink every one right down the bottom. Oh, yes, you do, don't you? All the ladies are nodding, yeah. I heard a gal today on a tape, and she said, what was it? She said, did you drink with people? Did you share your booze? Was that it? What did Holly say? Anyway, what she said was that if you're drinking her booze, she drank alone. If you're drinking your booze, she'd drink with you. That's the way I didn't know enough to do that. I ran up horrendous grocery bills at the grocery store, and I would blame it all on poor Herb, Everybody knew how he drank. And And Carp would say, Ann, I have to have, a little more money on this $300 bill. 98 cents isn't going to do it. And I would say, Carp, I'm doing the best I can. And one time I told him I owed him $1,160. Can you believe that in the grocery bill? This guy was a drunk. He shouldn't have let me do that. I had to go down after I got sober and pay him off. By that time I'm sure he had written it off as a bad debt and he got it twice. But anyway, that was his problem, not my problem. So he followed me up to school one day, which was a dirty trick because I never went in the store when he was there. When he was at the Elk Club is when I went into the store and charged my groceries. Anyway, he followed me up to school and he said to me, Ann, I have to have some money on this bill. And I said, Carp, I'm working, and I will certainly see that you get my next check entirely. My next check was $9.80, and the grocery bill was $1,200 and something. But I was honest. I was willing to give him the whole thing. It never occurred to me to quit drinking. Every time that Herb quit drinking, and he did it towards the end, as people do, I would go along with it, because I knew it wouldn't last very long. It wasn't a question of being dry forever, because he was only going to get better and go back out, and he did, poor guy. And they called me from the hospital the last time he was in, and Dr. Middleton said, if this man goes back to drinking, he's going to die. And I said, well, how are you going to stop him from drinking? And he said, that's up to you. I didn't know much, but I knew I didn't have any control over somebody else's drinking, I'll tell you that. So anyway, we continued on. Our 16-year-old son was killed in a car accident in 1964, the week before Christmas. And I suddenly gave up all these outside activities. I gave up the scouts and the room mother business and the whole thing. I didn't give up the booze, and I didn't give up the drinking. And it just progressed. I was writing the great American novel. Most of us write the great American novel while we're drinking. And I was writing away and drinking. And one night in August, Herb came down the corridor. We have sort of a long hallway, and he stood behind me, and I was sitting in my chair with my drink and my coffee cup as usual. And the kids were in bed, and I was pretending that everything was normal. And he said, why don't you come to bed? Well, by that time, going to bed was an absolutely useless playtime, I'll tell you that, It was hard on him, it was hard on me, or it wasn't hard at all, for, truth is known. But anyway, I don't know how I got into that one, but anyway. We were at that stage where not much happened after we went to bed. And I said, I'll just be there in a few minutes. And by this time, I'd been drinking for 10 years. I went to the doctor when I was pregnant with my son David, and I was crying and complaining, and Dr. Gaby suggested that I have a little glass of wine before I go to bed at night. And I went out and bought 5 gallons of the stuff to last the whole pregnancy, And of course it didn't last very long, and from then on I could drink all I wanted to because the doctor told me I could, right? Anyway, this night finally arrived, and Michael had been dead about 8 months, I guess. And we had this little scene that I just told you about, and I said out loud, and I said, oh God, what am I going to do? And I didn't know what I was going to do with me. I wanted to know what to do with him, And I heard this voice. It's one thing nice about being a drunk, you hear voices. I don't know whether you're schizophrenic or Welsh or what in the hell it is. But the voice said, why don't you quit drinking? We have this high ceiling, And I looked up there. I thought, who the hell is talking to me? And I said, why doesn't he quit drinking? I wasn't going to take that even from God. I thought, back with that. I knew who was a drunk in my family. And he repeated it. He said, why don't you quit drinking? So, I'm fair enough. I thought I would quit drinking and go to Al-Anon. That would solve our problem. Unfortunately, I had the wrong idea about Al-Anon. I thought you had to be sober to go to Al-Anon. I have found out since you don't have to be sober to go to Al-Anon. You can go to Al-Anon drunk and work the steps. Now, if I had known that, I could have gone there first, and maybe I would have not had to come here. But unfortunately, I didn't know that. And I was going to Al-Anon on Monday night, and by 6 o'clock I couldn't make it. I was going to Al-Anon on Tuesday night, at 6 o'clock I couldn't make it. Finally, about Wednesday night, I called a neighbor. And my neighbor had a handsome, intelligent, charming husband who I thought was on the program, and I figured he could take me along with him to the meeting. And instead it was her. She was a real bitch. She said, I'll pick you up. I thought, well, I didn't want her to pick me up. But I went along with it, and I didn't know what else to do. You're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar, you know. So I said, okay. So Lois came by and picked me up and went off to a meeting. And I walked into my first meeting in Los Osos. And I had lived in the town then about 10 years, maybe. And I knew everybody, and they knew me. But for some reason or another, I didn't expect that people in Alcoholics Anonymous would know me. I thought they were anonymous. And I had read the book, had stolen it from the library. And, well, what I did was I took it out, and then after I got my name out, I certainly wasn't going to take it back, you know. I had to write your name on the inside cover when they took out a book. And I thought, well, somebody else will think that I have a problem, so I never did get the book back. Finally had to buy him a new book as part of the amends, you know. Somebody else stole that. I noticed the other day they don't have a book. But anyway, everybody who gets their books at the Los Osos Library will please return money eventually. So anyway, I had this book, and this book said, we are 100 men and women who have found the, answer to alcoholism. And I thought, I wonder how they got out to Los Osos. And I walked into my first meeting, and I found out that, there were 12 men and women, and they were all neighbors, for God's sake, and they said, hi, Mrs. Hale, what are you doing here? And I tried to pretend I was there for the Girl Scout meeting, the Catholic daughters, something besides what I was really there for, I guess. And they didn't tell me I wasn't an alcoholic. I was waiting for them to tell me I wasn't an alcoholic. I was waiting for them to say anybody who is as great as you are cannot be an alcoholic. They didn't say that. I was waiting for them to say anybody who does as much as you do for the community. I just won the Outstanding Girl Scout Award for the year, for God's sake. Didn't they know that? And these alcoholics don't know things that go on out there in the normal world. They didn't realize how much I was doing for the good of the community. They knew that if I got into an AA meeting, I was probably a drunk. And for those people who are new here tonight, if you got into this meeting, you probably have a problem. Because very few social drinkers show up in Alcoholics Anonymous, wave their hands in the air and say, hi, I'm Ann and I'm an alcoholic. So anyway, I stuck around. I stuck around for about 8 months. And my husband kept drinking more and more, and he kept breaking his arm and doing this and that. He finally fell in the living room one Saturday evening. He broke his hip. He went into DTs in the hospital through a pulmonary embolism, and he died 1 week afterwards. I'd been on the program for 8 months. Hadn't learned a damn thing. All I knew was that I got out of the house 3 days a week and went to AA meetings, and I didn't drink. When Herb died, I remember what people said. They said, things will get better. I couldn't think of anything else that was any better. By that time, I wanted him out. I didn't want a husband. I was running to my sponsor saying, what am I going to do with this man? And she would say, like sponsors say, don't make any emotional changes for the first year. And so God did it. And he whisked him away. And so for the second time, in 15 months, I walked down that aisle at St. Timothy's Church following a casket, the incense burning and the candles burning, and everybody thought I was fabulous. And I thought I was fabulous. And then I discovered that when people die and they work for Division of Highways, people send you checks. They send you insurance checks and 6-month ward checks and vacation checks and Social Security checks. I was rich. And I thought, my God, isn't God wonderful? I'm rich. And they took the airplane out of the living room, which was sort of nice. We had this airplane, this station wagon. It had huge wings, and they were across the back of the living room. We have a huge living room, too. And it was sort of nice the last few months because we were redoing it, so you could drink wine, drink beer, and sniff glue all at the same time. And so somebody called from the airport, and they said, Ann, what can we do? I said, get this goddamn airplane out of my living room. That's what we can do. So they took the airplane out of the living room. And I paid up the bills. I even went down and paid Carp, He was flabbergasted. But anyway, I sold the truck, and I got a real car. It had 4 wheels, 4 doors, and a honk. It was a fabulous thing. It was a Newport station wagon. Chrysler Newport, 1964. And some guy last night was telling about his Chrysler Newport 1964 that he had on his last drunk. I think it was probably the same car, frankly. But anyway, and I thought I could drink again. It was as simple as that. Everything in my life was going well. I wasn't working. I had these 3 children at home. They were 10, 11, and 12 when Herb died. He died on the 5th of March, 1966. And things were just going too well. I didn't have a care in the world. I had all these people at Alcoholics Anonymous who loved me. I had, finances were in control. I was having the house finished finally after 10 years or so. And I certainly thought that now that I could afford to buy booze, I could afford to buy good booze, and I could have myself a Brandy Alexander. And it was as simple as that. A week later, I showed up at work drunk for the first time in my life. I went on duty at 7 o'clock on Sunday morning. I was in charge of the hospital and the emergency room. I was there about an hour, and Mary Turner came down the hall, and Mary was a day supervisor, fabulous nurse, better nurse than I would be if I lived to be 100 years old. But Mary Turner came down the hall, and she never showed up on Sunday. And I said, "Gee, Mary, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, Ann," she said, "I was going to work for you today. Didn't anybody tell you?" And I said, "No, nobody told me." And she said, "Well, why don't you go on home? I'm here and I got a lot of paperwork to do." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I'll have Hank drive you home." I said, "Well, he doesn't have to drive me home. I have the truck." And she said, "Well, you sure?" And I said, "Oh, sure, I'm okay. I can go home." And it never occurred to me until 10 years later that somebody had called Mary Turner because I was drunk on duty. And, I was responsible. I didn't know that. I thought that nobody ever knew that I had a drink. Nobody ever knew that I had a drinking problem. And after I'd been on the program again for a few months, a year or so, the Miss Stokes, who was charge nurse up at French Hospital, came to me one day and she said, "It's always been a pleasure having you here. She's sure been a lot nicer the last year or so." I thought, how does she know? How do those people know that we're drunks when all we do is sit at home and drink? How do they know we're not normal when we're out there doing all those things? Now I know, because I can tell if I'm in a crowd at the ball game who's had a drink over there and who's had a drink over there and the last time they had it and what they drank with it and everything else, It's amazing if you don't drink how good your nose gets. It's fantastic. You all smell pretty good tonight. Even the Al-Anons. I told the gal down at the restaurant we didn't need those little glasses of wine that they come out with, down there. So she gave us ice cream instead, but she charged us for it. I think we should have made a trade myself, but that's beside the point. Anyway, I crept back to Alcoholics Anonymous because there wasn't any place else to go. When I came back the second time, which was actually the third time, but the first time was only because I went with her. It was actually my second time. I wasn't the least bit pleased about the whole thing. I think retreading on Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the hardest things to do. First time I came on the program, I thought everybody was fantastic. When I came on the second time, I knew that there were feet of clay all over the place. Some people who gave a great AA pitch stole their friends' bad automobiles, And there were car salesmen on the program, for us. And it was that kind of a thing that was going on. And I had a real rough time, but I knew one thing, and I made a commitment. I sat in my armchair. One night I walked out on a meeting because it was on gratitude. I'd been around about 2.5 months or so. And I wasn't the least bit grateful. I wasn't sleeping yet, for one thing. And I wasn't happy. And I wasn't escaping reality. And I was stuck, with all these problems that suddenly arose when I got back. And my kids were back in school, and the newness of the affair of mother being in charge had worn off. And they weren't always behaving like I thought they would behave. And they had this stupid meeting on gratitude. "Oh, I'm so grateful. Oh, I'm so grateful." And anyway, I broke into tears and went home, So, of course, everybody called me and said, "What did I say?" We stay a little self-centered, regardless of how much time we have in the program. Anyway, I went home that night and I had my last drink. I sat there in that rocker, and we had other girls like myself, and there's always girls that are doing this, coming in and out, back and forth. And I made a commitment to Alcoholics Anonymous for 8 years. None of this day at a time business. I knew there were lots of days when I didn't feel like staying sober. So I made a commitment for 8 years that no matter what happened, I wouldn't take a goddamn drink. It was as simple as that. And if that's a spiritual experience, I don't know. But anyway, I made the commitment. And I went back to Alcoholics Anonymous the next night or so, and by this time, as I say, I was single, and I had the car, and I went to meetings every night. I had drank every night for years in that armchair with that coffee cup, and the lies and so forth. And so when I went back to AA, I had to finally take the chair out that I sat in and burn it, Not that it smells so bad, but it was just the idea that every time I sat in that chair, I wanted to drink. You know, like you sit in that chair, you want to drink. You know, a lot of your drinking processes is habit. You know, they used to say if you don't want to drink, don't go near the bar. Well, I didn't have trouble with bars, but I sure had a lot of trouble with that whole section in grocery stores that were covered with beer bottles and wine and so forth, and so I stayed out of those places. And I hung around the Alano Club. You know, like everybody else, you outgrow the Alano Club after a bit, but boy, that first few months it was a place to be. I played cribbage, supported a few of the fellas, you know, had a buck a game. Some guy even got a new motor in his car, for God's sake, you know, an engine and one. It was worth it. I learned one thing. I learned don't play cribbage at the Alano Club. That's what I learned. Went to a meeting every night and drove all over. In those days, we only had one meeting in Santa Maria, one meeting in Lompoc, one meeting up in Paso Robles, you know, and so you just drove around to that one meeting, knew everybody. And finally, a day at a time, I got through that first year of sobriety. I had a terrific birthday. You know, people came from all over. They'd see me shine for that. And all these people came, and I remember the few that didn't come. It's been 18 years, and I can name them for you. Some of them died because they didn't come. And so I got through that first year, and then I started sitting around thinking, is this all there is, you know? What the heck? I had a goal. See, I had a goal for this 1 year birthday and that cake, and everybody's singing, you know. And when I reached that goal, I didn't have anything else. You know, who wants a goal of 2 years for that? I finally, somebody said to somebody, you know, what'll I do now? And they said, why don't you try working the steps? Working the steps? I wasn't ready yet, you know. Well, maybe 3 years I'll work the steps. You know. First year I was still learning people's names. So I looked at the stupid steps. And I had read the steps, and I had read the book. Now this thing in here, you know, this thing down here tells you the whole thing. You don't have to listen to me for an hour. You can read what it says up here in front, and you can go home and stay sober. But actually what happened was that there were the steps, and I had it memorized, you know. If you're new around, been around for 6 months or so, you got that part of the 5th chapter memorized, you know. How rarely have we seen a person fail? A, B, C, you know, you get down to the end. What comes next, huh? The next thing it says, now that we're at the beginning of step 3, and we're self-centered, and, you know, and also little other things. And I said, well, at the bottom of chapter 5, what we read, if it says now we're at the beginning of step 3, what happened to steps 1 and 2? I have to go way back to the 3rd chapter to find step 1. Step 1 says we have to admit to our innermost selves that we are alcoholics. This is the first step in sobriety. You know, I didn't mind admitting to you I was an alcoholic. You know, you're a bunch of alcoholics yourself, you know. But when I got home at night, I wasn't sure inside that I was really an alcoholic. I thought after 8 years I'd go out and have a party. And I went way back to chapter 3, and it said you have to admit, people, you know, we are bodily and mentally different than other people. Well, you know, not me, maybe you. You might be. Maybe those guys last night were a little bit different, you know. But I thought, I don't think this program is for me. Well, as long as I'm committed to this thing for 8 years, I might as well read the steps over. So I finally got through. I didn't have any trouble turning my will and my life over to the care of God, making a decision to turn it over. I didn't really turn it over. I finally turned it over about 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago, maybe a year ago. I don't know, but it took me a long time to, you know, to do the paperwork and step back. Isn't that stupid? The footwork at Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, we do this time after time. We apply for college, you know, we get our clothes ready, we tell our friends we think we're going to college, and then we can't wait for God to decide which one is going to accept us. We start nagging. Finally God said, you know, same living room, same room. He said, hey, Andy, stop nagging, huh? I said, I'm just telling you what I want you to do. I had a terrible time with the 4th step. I came on this program and I didn't know any, I didn't have any inventory to take. I didn't have anything wrong with me. How can you take an inventory if you're perfect? I was under the illusion that I had spent all these years drinking because I had to. He had these 5 kids and his drunken husband and his unfinished house and his 3 dogs and 2 horses and 25 chickens. I had infinitum. You would have drank too, you know. And so I had a rough time with the 4th step. I finally took a 4th step after I'd been around for a while, and it wasn't very nice. You know, resentments were the people that talked too long at meetings. And the ones that said the same thing, you know. I put Arnie down, he always said the same thing. I put Oltha down, she always says the same thing. Everybody who had more time than I was, I put them down under resentment, you know. And that got rid of a heck of a lot of problems. And then I got thinking, how come I resent so many people? You know, maybe there's something wrong with me. This is a hard pill to swallow, let me tell you. But I managed to get through. I got through finally sat down, and I sat in the middle of my bed. I don't know how you're going to take the fourth step, but I'll tell you how I did it. I had the big book open to the fourth step. I had the little red book open to the fourth step. I had the little green book open to the fourth step. I had the fourth step I'd stolen from somebody else. And I used it all. And I came up with this fantastic fourth step. I'm sorry I lost it. I think probably one of my husbands afterwards burned it. But anyway, I came up with the fourth step, and I went off to my sponsor, and I said, I've got my fourth step. And I said, this is it. And she said, oh, well. She said, I haven't got time tonight. And I said, oh, but this is important. She was not that important. I thought maybe I had the wrong sponsor about that time, you know. I finally found somebody to listen to me, and they weren't too impressed with it either, frankly. But anyway, I got through the thing, and I had the shortcomings and the defects of character. Now, I spent a few years on shortcomings and defects of character because I was trying to sort them out into their proper piles. Which are the defects and which are the shortcomings, you know. I didn't want a mistake and do a shortcoming on the wrong step or a defect left over on the humble step, you know. And so I sorted them out, and they wouldn't come out, and finally, unfortunately, I read something that Bill Wilson said. And somebody said to Bill, how come you use shortcomings in one step and defects of character in the other step? And he said, well, they're both the same. He just didn't want to use it twice in the same step, you know, two steps. And I thought, Bill Wilson, I'm glad you're dead. Because you know, otherwise I would have argued with him, how can he do this to me? So I'm finally working on the defects of character, Gloria will be glad to hear that, and the shortcomings and so forth. And I found out now that I can work on those the rest of my life. Isn't that fantastic? You know, they never get very buried very deeply. A good fourth step will give you a whole list of defects of character. Intolerance, dishonesty, you know, self-centeredness. And then over here they're talking about things like humility. I'll never get the humility. I don't even, you know, I have a little trouble with it when they bring it up at a meeting. I pretend I'm asleep. And I had to start out and make amends. And, you know, I had a lot of trouble with amends because I didn't know how to make amends to this husband that died on me. Not the one that escaped before, but the one that died. And so I went to, you know, you go to enough meetings, you hear what you have to hear. And one night I went to a meeting, and the speaker said that when you had problems like that with people that you could not go to and make amends, that the thing to do was to write it out, and the thing to do is go down to the ocean or someplace like that, and read it out loud, yell it out loud if you have to, sit in the car, yell about it, and then go home and burn the paper, and you made your amends. And it relieved. It actually worked for me. I don't know whether it worked for any of you, and if any of you need to do that, but it worked for me. And I kept making little amends, you know, to people that had written me Christmas cards for 10 years of my drinking that I had never answered, because I never had time to answer Christmas cards. And people that I had lost track of from college and from the Army and places, because I didn't have time to keep track of all these people. You can't sit down at 8 o'clock at night and write cards and letters, and you can't even write your own name at 8 o'clock at night. You know, it's ridiculous. I don't know how they expect you to do these things. I finally got up to the rest of them, you know. I finally got to the maintenance steps. And that's when my life started getting better. It was amazing. When I started on prayer and meditation, and I don't do real good at that, except that I'm lucky. I have to drive 10 miles down Los Osos Valley to work every morning. And in case you don't know where God lives, he lives in Los Osos Valley. I'm sorry that you live so far away. But drive up, turn left at Howard Johnson's, and go down Los Osos Road, and you'll see him. He's in every hill, every top. It's fabulous. And I'll say, God, what do you think we ought to do today? And he said, you know, watch where you're driving, Ann. I said, but God, I got this problem. He'll say, why don't you let up a little bit? You're going too fast. So we have this sort of a good conversation. I have a guy with a fantastic sense of humor. And he proves it all the time. Proves it again this month. I said to him, you know, God, what I need is a man in my life. You know, I've been manless for a while now. And, you know, I haven't got enough problems. I want a man in my life. You know. So God said, no, Ann, you don't want a man in your life. I said, I need someone to take out the garbage, you know. I'm tired of picking up the garbage. Someone to turn on the heat in the morning, plug in the coffee. He answered my prayers, let me tell you. My 29-year-old son came home to live. He said, Mom, can I come home? And I said, sure, hon, come on home. Thank you, God, for everything. This goes on and on like that. I married on the program again. I caught a guy between the first and second step when he was powerless over alcohol before he got restored to sanity. It's probably the last one because I love the name Garrity. Don't you love the name Garrity? People say, God, that's an Irish name. And I said, yes, I inherited it from my last Italian husband. Anyway, unfortunately, he was sober and he was clean, but he wasn't very healthy. And we were only married 22 months and he died of cancer of the lung. And so for the third time in 7 years, I walked down that aisle at St. Timothy's Church in Morro Bay following a casket with that incense going and the candles burning and the priests intoning and so forth. And God and I were not on speaking terms then, in one way or the other, I was really madder than hell, to be perfectly honest. I had everything planned out with this guy. And so I went out to work a little bit later, and when I did that, I ran into God one morning. What's the matter, Ann? Do you have to go to the bathroom?
I'm having a problem. Go ahead.
Anyway, so I was coming up Los Osos Road, that's why I know where he lives now. This was years ago. And so I said to God, I said, you promised me things would get better. And I thought things were better. Bill Garrity was a nice guy. And everybody liked him, and I loved him, and we were doing fine. And what happened, And he said to me, he said, Ann, your good is coming, but you were Bill's good. And I could understand that, Because Bill was divorced. His children lived out in California, out in Chicago. His mother was 80 years old, lived down in Los Angeles. And so for some reason, I got to share the last couple of years, last 3 years with Bill Garrity. And I'm grateful because he actually helped with the children and he showed us what kind of a home we could have without a drinking father in the house. And it was fine. The last years now, of course, eventually I had to go back to work. I spent all the money. You got to go back to work. The kids grew up, and one became a nurse, and one became a plumber, and one became a kennel keeper, whatever, and one is home with mother, He works too, but anyway, I just say that. And I started getting, my hair started getting gray, for God's sakes. And, I came on here, I had brown hair, sparkly eyes, no glasses. I was weighed 120 pounds. Not really. Not really. And I started growing up. And growing up has been rather difficult for me. I don't know about you people who are growing up on this program of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it has been a little difficult. I did learn to live alone. And I really enjoy living alone, to be honest. I don't live actually alone. I rent a room down at the other end of the house. But I've learned to adjust to what God has gives me today. And when I once gave up and let God give me what he wanted to give me instead of what I wanted to have, life has been fantastic. It turns out that when I'm directing traffic, I don't do a very good job. And every day I look around at something that I thought I wanted, or someone that I thought I wanted, or some job that I thought I wanted, and I'm grateful that I didn't get the job, the person, or the thing. It's amazing. The things that if I had gotten what I asked for on this program of Alcoholics Anonymous, God, I don't know what would. I've been a mess. I can't believe, and I decided to stand last year. I was down, I've been around general service for 18 years. I was at the first PRASA. I've been at most of the Pacific Regional Service Assemblies. I've been at the forums. I've been at the internationals, and I've been GS General Service Representative and a district committee member. And so my friend down in San Diego last March said to me, she said, why don't you stand for delegate? Well, when are you going to stand for delegate? And I said, I'm not going to stand for delegate. She said, of course you are. She said, it's time that you stood for delegate. And I said, oh, I don't think so. And she said, let God decide. Well, this is a big decision to leave to God, So I said, okay, I'll stand for delegate. So Jim O came by, running with his cigar in his mouth like Tip O'Neill. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to stand for delegate. He said, oh, Ann, you can't get delegate. I said, I didn't say I was going to get it. I said, I'm going to stand for it. Somebody else, Ralph, came by. He met me, came down, and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to stand for delegate. And he said, oh, man, nobody gets delegate that hasn't been, an area officer. And I said, I didn't say I was going to get it, Ralph. I said, I'm going to stand for him. And my boss said, once you retire, you're spending too much time on these outside activities. And I said, I'm not going to retire. You can fire me. I'll get my unemployment, but I'm not going to retire. And he said, I think you ought to retire. He said, these things are taking too much of your time. You're not giving us your best shot here at work. So we came to a compromise, and we compromised on 4 days a week. I work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, which is fabulous. I have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off to run back and forth if I get to be delegate. I had a car. It had 112,000 miles on it. It worked fine as far as I was concerned. My kids were getting a little bit annoyed at me driving up and down with it. And I'm sitting in my armchair one day in the living room, and I'm asleep. And me and my cat, and all of a sudden they're screaming. All the neighbors are screaming, ah, get out of the house, get out of the house. Well, anyway, I had a fire in my front yard, and it burned my hand-hewn redwood fence that my husband had hand-hewn 20 years ago. And it was worth a fortune. In fact, it got me a new car, for God's sakes. This fence, plus the car got a little blistered, and the insurance company came through, and I got a new car. Now, a new car to me is a 79 Granada instead of a 77 Monarch. I'm not really too hip on, new cars. And I went down, as I said earlier, I went down and I stood for delegate, and I got it with 80% of the votes. I have a chance to replay Alcoholics Anonymous for all the things that have been given to me and all the things that have not been given to me. And believe me, they are equally as important. The things I have gotten are as important as the things I have not gotten in this program. I'm pleased today. I'm carrying on my job and I'm doing it well. I can manage my household. I can keep myself fairly healthy. And I can pay back the things that I feel that I owe to Alcoholics Anonymous for this kind of life, because my mother at this age had had her first stroke and was still looking for her booze. My father had his first heart attack and was still having problems. And so I'm grateful tonight that everything that has happened to me since I made that decision, I have to tell you, of course, the kid got to be 18 years old and I'm still in the program, but anyway, I finally learned to live a day at a time. It's a lot easier than 8 years at a time. But I can't say enough. If you're new here tonight, keep coming back, because it's the only chance you got for fun and for life. And that's exactly the way I feel about the program. Thank you.